Hello, my beautiful ancient history fans. Welcome to Ancient History Bytes with Eric. Today's episode 5 in my video series on ancient history, and our topic for today is Middle Kingdom Egypt. That's right, we're leaving Babylon, going back to Egypt, my favorite place, and honestly, it's so hot in DC here today, it feels like I could be in ancient Egypt, but the show must go on. So Middle Kingdom Egypt was a high point in Egyptian civilization. They had just gone out of a long, dark period full of strife and civil war. They were reunited by King Montuhotep II and came back better than ever before. This was a high point for ancient Egyptian literature. Many of the classics were written during this period, and it was also a period of major expansion for Egypt. They expanded northeast into Palestine and Syria, and they also expanded deep south into Nubia, making the empire bigger than it ever was before. So I'm very excited for this episode today to share with you my love of this period. So let's pray to the god Thoth, god of wisdom and knowledge, to help guide us on our journey through ancient history today.
Will you depart, pray, Father Ra, before you commend me? Will the sky clothe you, pray, before you commend me? Commend me tonight and those who are in it, so as to find me among those who honor you, O Ra, those who worship you at your rising, who lament at your setting. I am your deputy. You made me possessor of life, to whom no death comes. I am a nursling in the early morning. I am a nursling in the evening hours, but the anger of your eye is my protection. You find me as a reward.
Okay, so our topic for today is Middle Kingdom Egypt, which is the second major high point in ancient Egyptian civilization, the first being the Old Kingdom, which we talked about 2 episodes ago. So the Middle Kingdom starts around the year 2050 BC with the reign of a great king named Montuhotep II. He unified Egypt after a long period of civil war to form the Middle Kingdom, the beginning of the Middle Kingdom. So here's our little timeline of ancient Egyptian history, so you can kind of place this within its historical context. So Montuhotep II would be revered for hundreds of years after his death as a hero and savior of Egypt. He united Egypt, saved it from this dark, dark period. But before we delve too much into Montuhotep and the Middle Kingdom, let's take a step back into Egypt's first dark period, the first intermediate period, to help us better understand how the Middle Kingdom was so much different from what came before. Okay, so the inscription that was read at the beginning of this episode comes from one of the kings of this first intermediate period, and I think it really conveys how shaken royal power and royalty themselves were as a result of this period. Inscriptions of the Old Kingdom are boastful, proud, powerful, even haughty at times, while this inscription is reflective and vulnerable, acknowledging that the pharaohs are at the whims of the gods and humbly asking whether they will stay and protect the king. Quite a change from the Old Kingdom, really. I really love the inside look that this provides at the king's inner thoughts and fears, something we don't usually get from a royal inscription like this. So it was a beautiful period in terms of opening the Egyptians up to writing about different motifs and showing a little bit of vulnerability. So that's really interesting thing to come out of this period. So anyway, in the last episode, we talked about the Old Kingdom, and we discussed how towards the end of the 6th dynasty, royal power was starting to falter. Regional elites were starting to gain more power. Eventually, after the reign of Pepi II, there was a total collapse of central authority, and regional nomarchs, as they're called, sort of regional governors, became veritable kings of their own little areas. So this is what began the first intermediate period and what characterized the early part of the period. This situation persisted for quite a while, but slowly these smaller chiefdoms sort of coalesced into larger political units. And eventually we ended up with basically 2 different political units, like we had it earlier in Egypt's history, the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom. The kingdom in the south was centered at Thebes, which was a major regional center at this time. And then the kingdom in the north was centered at Heracleopolis, which you can see in this map here. So the kings of these 2 kingdoms, of course, wanted control over all of Egyptian territory, So a long and protracted civil war erupted between the two that would last almost a century. So 100 years of fighting and fighting over who could control all of Egypt. Must not have been a great time for the people. A lot of strife, famine, and suffering. So this would always be remembered as a very terrible period in their history, and this would reflect in literature of the Middle Kingdom, looking back in fear on this period and hoping that it would never happen again. So much of the fighting during the Civil War took place in the area where the two territories sort of meet, which is very close to the city of Abydos. And one of the main events that took place during this war and that left a lasting scar on the ancient Egyptian psyche was the destruction of the sacred necropolis and temples at Abydos. So this was a huge deal. This necropolis held the remains of Egypt's earliest kings and was also seen as the most sacred place of the god Osiris, one of the most important gods in the Egyptian pantheon. So it really was one of the most sacred sites in ancient Egypt. And the fact that the northerners came and destroyed this temple and this necropolis was seen as just a step way too far. It was getting out of hand. You were basically laughing in the face of the gods by doing this. And perhaps the eventual victory of the south over the north was the gods' revenge for this heinous act. So this is the first intermediate period. Not a fun period to live through, but one really fun and interesting thing that we do have from this period is we have the first documented evidence in history of a dog lover. Yes, that's right. We have a stela of King Intefla. He was the first dog lover in history. He was buried with his 5 canines, and they're pictured in his funerary stela, which you can see here. It's in a museum in Egypt, so I couldn't find any great pictures of it, but I think that's really wonderful that for the first time in history, we know somebody who loved dogs, because I also love dogs. So that is the first intermediate period. And so as I just alluded to, eventually the southern kingdom, with its capital at Thebes, would overcome the north, uniting Egypt into one kingdom again, restoring Ma'at, divine order, finally. This feat was accomplished by the king we mentioned before, Montuhotep II, a great warrior king. And the fact that he was a great warrior king could even be seen in his name. Montu, who I'm showing here, is a great god of Thebes, and he's a god of war. And Montuhotep means Montu is pleased or Montu is satisfied. So this king was ready to fight, and he won. So what a fitting name for a conquering king. So Egypt was reunited by this king, Montuhotep, around the year 2050 BC. This came about through a bloody and vindictive battle at the northern capital city of Heracleopolis. So basically, Montuhotep and his army, invaded and tried to seize Heracleopolis, and they succeeded. The southerners from Thebes sacked the city, probably killing or enslaving a huge proportion of the population. So that was probably not great PR for starting a new kingdom. And for a long time after this, northerners would be considered the enemy of Egypt, and Egypt would enter into sort of a police militarized state for much of the Middle Kingdom out of fear that there could be an uprising and the kingdom would split again. So we'll discuss that more later in the episode, but this is the background and framing for how we're starting the Middle Kingdom. Okay, so that was Montuhotep II, a great king, probably one of the greatest kings of the Middle Kingdom. After him, we had a couple of other lesser known and less important Montuhoteps running around, so we'll skip over them. But then a few kings down the line, we had a new king who was actually a commoner. So this led to a new dynasty, the 12th dynasty. His name was Amenemhat I. So how a commoner came to power is a little bit unknown. It's a little bit shifty because this was very unusual for power to pass from royalty to non-royalty. So it seems like maybe there was some sort of light coup that happened. Now, Amenemhat was, we think, the vizier of the previous king. So he was close to power, was the king's right-hand man. So it sort of made sense that it was passed to him. But Amenemhat knew that he was going to have to explain to the Egyptian people why he, a commoner, deserved to be king and why he had become king. So taking a page out of our friend Sargon's book, he created a legend about himself that he basically had commissioned into a small piece of literature, which was called a prophecy. So basically, in this letter, it says he was prophesied to become king, one day. So it's kind of funny that he explains why he's able to be king by a letter that he himself commissioned saying that he was meant to be king. But whatever, people apparently believed it. He was able to become king. Not too many issues throughout his early kingship. And you'll actually come to see that Middle Kingdom kings were no stranger to propaganda. They wielded the pen for their own purposes, and much of the literature at this time was actually sort of propagandist in nature. That doesn't make it any less great. It's still great literature, but we should read it with a grain of salt. A lot of these events, have a bit of a spin on them, a political spin. So we won't dwell on Amenemhat too much because we have a lot of other stuff to discuss, but we will discuss one very important thing that he did, which is moving the capital from Thebes in the south, which was sort of the home of these southern kings, down to the Fayum Oasis, which is near the Delta, to a newfound city that they called Ijtawi, which means seizing the two lands. So this was another way of saying, yes, we did it. We united Egypt. We seized the two lands and put them back together. So this may seem like not a huge deal, just a little, asterisk in history, but moving a capital from one city to another takes a ton of resources, especially at this time. You had to, and especially since this city didn't exist before, they created a new city for it. So you had to create administrative buildings, you had to create a palace, you had to create temples, you had to create warehouses, storehouses, manufacturing centers, homes for the elites. You had to construct all this stuff in order to move the royal palace there. And then not to mention, you also had to get the people there, and transport was not easy at this period in time. I mean, just think about moving the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., to Lincoln, Nebraska, for whatever reason, because we wanted to be closer to the agricultural center of the country. I mean, even today, that would be kind of crazy. People would be like, what? And it would be a huge deal. That would, make headlines for weeks or months. It would be kind of crazy. So at this time, it was also, I mean, the Pharaoh could do what he wanted, but it was like, oh, wow, okay, we're moving to Ijtawi, great. So they did that, and this was a big deal. The Fayum Oasis was very strong with agricultural potential because it was an oasis. It was like sort of like a lake in the middle of the desert. It was lush. You could grow crops there. You could irrigate. You could do all this stuff. It was also protected by Sobek, the fearsome crocodile god, who was the patron deity of this area. And so he wasn't going to let any enemies get in there and attack them under Sobek's protection. So that was another benefit of the area. And so we don't totally know why Amenemhat wanted to move the capital there, but it seems there were several reasons. One of them being that, like I said, this was an area with strong agricultural potential, so they probably wanted to exploit that for the palace's purposes. Secondly, Ijtawi had the benefit of being close to the Delta and those pesky northerners so that they could keep an eye on them, but not in the old capital Memphis, so that they would be imbued in all of this political drama that, I'm sure happened between the royal families there because they'd been powerful elites there for generation upon generation. So they wanted to be removed from the old capital, but still able to keep their eye on these meddling northerners. And so that is most likely why they moved the capital to Ijtawi. And it would remain there for the rest of the Middle Kingdom. So big move by Amenemhat. So the other more insidious reason that Amenemhat is fairly well known to history is that it was very likely that he was assassinated by his courtiers. So all was not right in the palace. Presumably people were upset that a non-royal had become the king ahead of them, perhaps. And so he seemed to have been murdered. And so they did succeed in murdering him, but they did not succeed in taking power from his family, because it is the case that his son, Senusret I, a very capable man, ended up becoming king. So these schemers and plotters did not get their way in the end. So power passed from King Amenemhat to King Senusret I, his son, rather seamlessly, despite the assassination attempt, because Senusret had actually served as co-regent with his father for a number of years to sort of learn the tools of the trade and to make it very clear who was going to be succeeding Amenemhat. So we think Amenemhat was probably the first king to do this in ancient Egypt, to do this whole co-regency thing. And then this would happen rather frequently, maybe not for every reign, but for many, many reigns in the future of Egypt, just so the new king could kind of learn the ropes and also to be more sure of the succession, so there wasn't really any question who was going to be succeeding because that person was already ruling with the current king. So Senusret came to power relatively easily, and one very interesting thing that he did is he wanted to record for posterity, for history, this assassination plot. He wanted to out these people and really make it known that this happened, presumably to prevent it in the future. And so in ancient Egyptian society, they didn't love to write down bad events, bad things that had happened, discuss evil topics or dangerous topics. Because when you wrote it down, it gave it sort of a magical power to happen again or keep recurring. So they often refrained from talking about these things directly. And so what Senusret decided to do was commission a couple of works of literature about this. Because if you wrote it down on papyrus in the form of a story, it was way more palatable, way less scary than if you wrote it down on a stela as history. So he commissioned at least 2 works describing the assassination plot. One of them is one of the most famous works in ancient Egyptian literature. It's called the Tale of Sinuhe, and it tells the story of sort of a courtier of King Amenemhat. Of course, he's not named that necessarily in the story, but it tells the story of a courtier who hears of this assassination plot and actually flees the country out of fear. So we'll read a little bit from that because I think it's really interesting, and you'll see how really obliquely they talk about the assassination plot. It's just sort of a vague reference, but everyone reading it would know what they meant. So the story goes, year 30, month 3 of autumn, day 7, the god ascended to his horizon. King Sehotep Ibra mounted to heaven and was united with the sun, the divine flesh mingling with its creator. The residence was in silence. Hearts were in mourning. The palace portal was shut. The entourage was bowed down, and the patricians in grief. So this first part is obviously about the death of the king Amenemhat. The tale goes on, and notice again that it never mentions the assassination plot outright. You really have to read between the lines here. The courtiers of the royal retinue sent to the western border to inform the prince of the affair which had happened in the audience hall. Not a moment did he wait at all. The falcon flew off with his followers, without informing his expedition. Now, when I, Sinuhe, was standing on duty, I heard his voice as he spoke, the king's voice. As I was a little way off, my heart collapsed, my arms spread out, trembling fell on every limb. I removed myself, shaking, to seek a hiding place for myself. I put myself between 2 bushes to avoid the path and its traveler. So you see, it's never discussed exactly what happens, but we can assume from the narrator's perspective and his reaction to whatever news he heard, his trembling, his shaking, his fear, that this is what they're talking about. This event in the palace or the event in the audience hall is the assassination plot. And then this courtier becomes very fearful and has to flee Egypt because he's not sure what's going to happen. So I just think that's a really cool and unique way to write about something like this. It gives it in such an area of mystery, mystique, suspense, and you're kind of wondering, are they ever going to come out and say what actually happened in this story? Well, you'll have to read it to find out. The Tale of Sinuhe. It's not very long, and it's a quick read, and it's kind of fun. So that was King Senusret I. Okay, so now we'll fast forward about 100 years or so to talk about the most important king of the Middle Kingdom, Senusret III. So Senusret was an imposing figure. He stood 6 foot 6 inches tall, which was absolutely huge for the time. So a massive man. And not only was he this tall, he had a deeply sunken face, hollow cheekbones, and very large ears, as you can see in one of his statues here. And so, of course, this might not have been exactly what he looked like. They just wanted to portray him this way, but even still, kind of interesting to want to be portrayed this stark and severe. So he was a formidable man and king, one of the greats of ancient Egyptian history. So Senusret III was very militaristic and expansionist. He pushed Egypt's boundaries much further into Nubia, where Egypt's power extended up to the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south, which is pretty deep into Nubia. And so he was kind of the epitome of the warrior king of Egypt. He seemed almost invincible in battle, always leading his troops in person and from the front. And this is a ruler that the people truly wanted and needed to restore and maintain Ma'at, make Egypt great again, and just keep this divine order that the Egyptians so loved. To maintain control of these newly conquered areas and to subjugate the Nubians, Senusret III built a series of very formidable forts all along the southern portion of the Nile in Nubia, and they were all within signaling distance of each other, so you could light one and send a message up the chain if you needed to, that the Nubians were attacking. The forts had kind of ridiculously aggressive sounding names, one of them being Destroying the Nubians, for example. So pretty terrifying for any Nubians. And all ships traveling down the Nile from Nubia would have to stop at these forts, be inspected, pass through customs, pay taxes, all that kinds of stuff. And probably with an army of archers trained on their crew the whole time. So this must have been a very harrowing experience for the Nubians coming into Egypt, or Egyptians, honestly, who had traveled to Nubia. Just so you see an example, here's a construction of one of these forts. This is the fortress at Buhen, which was probably the largest one. And you can see it's built almost exactly like a medieval castle, with a series of walls, moats, ramparts, and towers. So it's a very formidable fortress meant to defend Egypt. So just imagine for a second that you're a Nubian trader sailing down along the Nile, entering Egypt to sell gold or ivory or whatever you might have. And so you sail around a bend in the Nile, and you see this giant fortress named Destroying the Nubians. You sail on by, waving at the Egyptians, trying to look friendly as possible, as they've got their archers trained on you, and they're signaling you to dock for inspection. It's hard to imagine the fear that would pulse through these people's bodies as they are taking their boats to get inspected by the Egyptians, who were ready to attack if anything was amiss. So this fear, this is exactly what Senusret III wanted. He wanted to make rebellion, war, or really any type of disorderly conduct seem like the absolute worst idea you could ever think of. And it seems like he probably succeeded in this regard, because we really didn't hear a peep out of Nubia during most of his reign and for quite some time. All it took was a campaign of terror. So Senusret, certainly not like a friendly, wonderful guy. He was an imposing figure. Senusret also made a very important administrative reform. He abolished the title of nomarch, those local governors that we talked about in previous episodes that became so pesky and disorderly during the First Intermediate period. So he recalled all the nomarchs back to the capital and eliminated their positions in the nomes, the local regions. And instead, he split Egypt into 3 administrative regions: Lower Egypt, Upper Egypt, and then the south past Aswan, so Nubia, basically. And he installed a ruling council in each one, all reporting directly to his vizier and to him. So basically, Senusret III re-centralized power in Egypt, exerting a lot more direct pharaonic control. So the centralized state was back, baby, with Senusret III. This was a lasting accomplishment of his. Interestingly, this also led to a better distribution of income, because now, with old families' powerful political positions no longer available, more ordinary, lower-level administrators could kind of work their way up through the system. And so this led to a better distribution of power and wealth. So there was a little bit of a democratization of political power in at least a small way. So all in all, Senusret III is considered to be one of Egypt's greatest kings, and certainly the greatest king of the Middle Kingdom. Okay, so now sadly we have to move to the end of the Middle Kingdom, but here we have another interesting historical feat. It was the first woman king in Egypt, and probably the first woman king in the world, King Neferusobek. So she was a full king. She had all the kingly titles. She was not a queen or just a queen regent or anything. She was given all the titles of the king. So Egyptian kings had 5 official titles. And what they did is they just feminized all of these. So in the ancient Egyptian language, if you put a T at the end of something, it becomes feminine. And so she was still instead of the son of Ra, now she was the daughter of Ra, which in Egyptian you would just put a T at the end, so it's Satra instead of Sara. And so she was fully king, but just in a feminized way. And so this would be different from future female Egyptian kings like Hatshepsut, who would sort of try to masculinize himself and appear as almost a male king. Neferu Sobek didn't do that. She just was king, but a woman. So, this was really a first in history and quite interesting. Unfortunately, she came to power as a result of a relatively sticky situation. So similar to what we would see in Europe earlier, Egyptian royalty intermarried a lot in the same family. Brothers married sisters, half-brothers married sisters, very close-knit because they wanted to keep that power super concentrated and centralized. So Neferu Sobek was married to her half-brother. And of course, after generations of this intermarriage, they had run into some fertility issues. Either the men or the women in the family or both were often infertile, couldn't produce children, and if they did produce children, they weren't very healthy and they would probably die relatively young. So this was starting to become a big problem, especially towards the time of Neferu Sobek. Because after several years of marriage, Neferu Sobek and her husband, Amenemhat IV, hadn't managed to produce a single heir. Upon Amenemhat's death, the royal house had really no choice but to make Neferu Sobek king. This was an unusual step and certainly not considered optimal, but the king had to be royal, somehow related directly by blood to the previous king. And so presumably, with no heirs, they made her king, at least to bide time to figure out what to do with the succession. So the Egyptian kingdom found itself in a deep succession problem. Naming Neferu Sobek king was a band-aid for a much larger problem. There was simply no heir to rule Egypt, and there was really no possibility of producing one. So it's in a bad situation, the royal house. And meanwhile, a group of Canaanite immigrants in Egypt's northern area, so close to Canaan, this group was becoming more and more powerful. They were called the Hyksos, and we'll hear a lot more about them in the future. This group, the Hyksos, would become a major problem for the Egyptians. So much so that, in fact, in the ensuing chaos and instability after Neferu Sobek's death, they would manage to completely take over northern Egypt, establishing a capital at Avaris and ruling this area for over 100 years. So we've now entered Egypt's second dark period, called the Second Intermediate Period, where much of Egypt was ruled by foreigners, which was really not palatable for the Egyptians. And so we'll talk about this period in a later episode. But first, for our next episode, we're finally going to move over to the Greek Isles to talk about a civilization there. The first that we know of in this area, there are the Minoans on the island of Crete. So I'm really looking forward to a little Mediterranean foray, get some sun, and do some bull jumping. So hopefully you can join me next time on Ancient History Bytes. We'll see you then.